He rode into the snow like he still owned her, the same man who left her pregnant and alone, thinking he could waltz back and claim what he once discarded. But she didn't flinch. She stepped forward, belly full, eyes burning with quiet fury. And when he demanded the child, she simply pointed to the silent cowboy standing beside her and said, "This child already has a father, and it's not you." What kind of pain makes a girl say that with fire in her voice? And who was the man she now called family? Without blood, without vows, only trust. This is the story of a girl who was sold, a man who had lost everything, and the baby who gave them both a reason to believe again. The wind bit down from the mountains that morning, dragging with it the scent of pine smoke, cold iron, and the weary breath of men who'd seen too many winters. Silas Merrick stepped into the edge of Dustwood Ridge's market, his boots crunching against frozen mud. He hadn't come for anyone, not for redemption, not to rescue a soul, just a sack of nails and maybe salt for the meat barrel. He pulled his collar higher, the black wool of his duster coat whispering around him like a ghost. The voices in the market were loud, too loud. Livestock bleated, barterers shouted, metal clanged. But beneath the surface noise, Silas heard what always followed him, the silence, the kind that lived inside old men, the kind that clung to the corners of cabins long after laughter had left. He passed a stall trading chickens for bullets, another bartering flour for boots. A child cried nearby, then was quickly hushed. His eyes scanned, not out of interest, but instinct, one beaten into him from war and solitude. He hadn't dreamed last night, but he had remembered. 10 winters back, outside of Salt River, there had been another girl. Dirt on her cheek, barefoot in snow, hand outstretched as a wagon passed. His wagon. He hadn't stopped. Just stared ahead, jaw clenched. He still saw her sometimes, in dreams and firelight, in the corner of his vision. Always reaching, never saved. Then he heard it. Not a cry, not a scream. Something quieter. A transaction. A man's voice, raw from drink, slurring through a bargain. "She's strong enough to sweep a floor, chop weeds. Won't give you trouble unless you let her rest too long. Take her off my hands. $2 or a sack of oats." Walter Brooke, the voice belonged to. His coat was threadbare, his boots split at the toe, and he stank of liquor and lost dignity. Next to him stood a girl, barely more than a shadow wrapped in a tattered shawl. Adeline, though no one said her name aloud. She didn't speak, not once. Her head bowed, bonnet low, hair tangled. Her hands clutched the fabric of her skirt like it was the last thing keeping her upright. Her silence wasn't empty. It was a hymn without words, something sacred and buried deep. Someone snorted nearby. "That one's broken. No fire left." Silas stopped walking. His breath came out in a slow cloud. He looked at her and something shifted inside him. Not loudly, not clearly, but enough. Another man offered $1.50 and a flask of whiskey. Silas stepped forward. $3, he said, voice flat. "And you never speak her name again." Walter blinked at him, narrowed his eyes. "You buying or rescuing, mister?" Silas didn't answer. He dropped the coins into the man's palm. The clink of metal rang final. "She's yours now," Walter muttered, turning away. "May she do better by you." The road north was narrow and winding, cut through frost-bitten pines and rock-split hills. Silas Merrick held the reins with practiced ease, guiding the mare through snow-packed ruts while the girl beside him clutched his coat like a lifeline. She hadn't said a word since they'd left Dustwood Ridge. Not one. But Silas wasn't the sort who needed words. He spoke anyway. "Storm's rolling in by nightfall," he muttered, eyes on the trail. "Best we get the fire lit before she finds us." No response. Just the soft creak of wagon wood and the hush of pine branches brushing overhead like quiet prayers. "I don't expect anything from you," he added. "You don't owe me gratitude. Or stories." Still, nothing. But her shoulders shifted, barely under the shawl. Silas glanced sideways. She was small, drawn tight inside that coat like a bird trying not to be seen. Her cheeks were red with cold. But she was here, and breathing. That counted for something. "Loneliness doesn't echo," he said suddenly, almost to himself. "It just absorbs everything." He wasn't sure why he'd said it aloud. Maybe because it was true. The cabin up ahead, his home for near 6 winters, had learned the shape of his silence, the rhythm of one man moving through rooms that used to hold laughter. It had soaked up every memory of Maeve, his late wife, and buried it somewhere beneath the floorboards. She loved spring flowers, daisies mostly. Silas used to tease her for picking them even when snow still clung to the roots. After she died, he stopped looking for them, stopped noticing when they bloomed. But now, he saw something, a flash of color just off the trail, a single red petal caught in the snow, stubborn and brilliant against the white. He blinked, unsure if it was real, but it was enough to make him glance again at the girl beside him. Adeline, though he hadn't asked her name yet, held his coat around her like armor. That red petal and her fingers looked equally fragile. By the time the cabin came into view, sloped roof, leaning porch, thin trail of smoke from the chimney, twilight had already fallen. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop, jumped down, and held out a hand. She hesitated before taking it. Her fingers were cold and small. Inside, the fire had died to embers. He set to work immediately, feeding the stove while she stood stiff in the doorway. He ladled soup into a clay bowl and placed it on the table. It's not much, but it's warm. Still no words. Later that night, she crouched before the hearth, flint in hand, trying to spark a fire on her own. Her hands shook. Sparks fizzled out. Silas moved beside her, kneeling. "Let me show you." Together, they struck flint against stone. When the spark finally caught on the dry moss, it flickered. Brief, trembling, alive. She stared at it like it was a miracle, and maybe in a way it was. Morning came slow, gray and quiet, the kind of stillness only winter could bring. Silas Merrick was splitting logs out back when he noticed the faint clink of a spoon through the cabin window. Adeline was up early again, moving carefully across the kitchen space, her shoulders hunched, sleeves rolled past her wrists. She hadn't said much in the weeks since she arrived, still didn't, but her presence no longer felt like a stranger's. It felt like someone learning how to breathe again. That afternoon, while bringing in a stack of firewood, Silas paused in the doorway. She didn't notice him watching. She sat at the table, a patch of sunlight brushing across her face. In her lap, a square of cloth, needle in hand, fingers slow and deliberate. What she was making was small, tiny in fact. The soft outline of a baby's cap began to take shape under her trembling stitches. Silas stood still, the wood heavy in his arms, and suddenly it clicked. The weariness, the careful way she moved, the way her hands sometimes rested over her stomach when she thought no one was looking. He said nothing then. Just set the wood down and stepped back outside into the cold. That evening, she lingered by the fire after supper, staring into the flames as if trying to find answers there. Her voice came out low, barely above a breath. "I didn't think you'd keep me once you knew." Silas looked up from where he sat, sharpening a blade. She didn't meet his gaze. "I'm pregnant," she said, voice tightening. "Been that way since before Dustwood. My father didn't tell anyone. Said I'd fetch less if they knew." Silas said nothing, just set the knife aside. Adeline's hands curled into the arms of the chair. "No one wants a girl already broken," she whispered. "Used up, ruined before she even had a chance." Silas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the firelight casting long shadows across his weathered face. His mind had already gone somewhere else. Back years, maybe a lifetime, to the day Maeve had held their neighbor's newborn, just for a moment, and whispered, "I'd trade all the gold in Wyoming for just one heartbeat like this." It had stayed with him, that ache in her voice, that longing. Adeline's eyes flicked toward the mantel, where Maeve's photo still hung. Her voice softened. "I don't know who she was, but she looks kind, like someone who would have let me stay, even knowing." Silas swallowed, throat tight. I want to name the baby after her," she said. "If it's a girl. I want her to have something good." Silas didn't speak. He simply nodded once firmly and stood. Later that night, in the quiet of the back room, he took out a small block of pine and a whittling knife. His hands trembled as he carved the name slowly, each letter like a prayer. M-A-E. The world outside was still white with late winter, the snow packed thick against the edges of the cabin porch. Silas Merrick had just finished stacking the last of the morning's firewood when he heard the sound of hooves, slow, deliberate, unfamiliar. He didn't need to look to know this wasn't a passing rancher or a neighbor. No one from around here rode with that kind of rhythm, that kind of confidence. He wiped the frost from the edge of the window and saw a figure dismounting. Jasper Crowley. A man who looked like he belonged in a saloon more than the backwoods, with a coat too fine for the cold and boots that had never seen mud. His horse snorted, restless. Jasper, however, looked entirely unbothered by the biting wind. 3 knocks, sharp, demanding. Silas opened the door just enough to fill the frame. "You Merrick?" the man asked, tugging off his gloves with a slickness that grated. "I am. Name's Jasper Crowley. I'm here to see the girl, Adeline. Heard she's been staying up this way, carrying my child." Silas's expression didn't change, but the tension beneath it shifted like a coiled wire. "She's not taking visitors," Jasper smirked. "Don't think it's your call." Before Silas could reply, a voice rose behind him. "It's mine." Adeline stepped forward into the doorway, one hand resting beneath the swell of her stomach, the other wrapped tightly in the sleeve of Silas's patched sweater. Her cheeks were pink from the fire, but her gaze was cool, steady. Jasper blinked at the sight of her. "Addie." She didn't respond, didn't flinch, just stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath her slow, deliberate stride. "You came all this way," she said quietly. "Why?" He gave her a rehearsed shrug. "Thought maybe I should do the right thing. Be part of the boy's life." "The boy," she echoed. He nodded toward her belly. "He's mine, isn't he?" She stared at him for a long moment before replying. "You watched my father sell me," she said, voice hardening. "Watched him trade me off like I was kindling. You said nothing, not one word. You turned away like I was nothing." Jasper's smile faltered. "That wasn't my choice." "But leaving was," she said, the words like flint against stone. "You could have stopped him. You didn't." A memory fluttered in the back of her mind, a voice from Dustwood Ridge, spoken through a sneer. "No man will want you after this." She had believed it once, carried it like a scar. Now she let it burn away. "You don't get to call him that," she said, voice rising. "He's not yours. You gave up that right." "You can't just erase blood," he snapped. She stepped forward, close enough he could see the steel in her eyes. "Blood's easy. Staying is hard. This child already has a father, one who held my hand when I was sick, one who built a cradle, one who never asked for anything but gave me everything." Jasper's mouth opened, then shut again. Behind her, Silas stepped silently onto the porch, laying a firm hand on her shoulder. Not claiming, not possessing, just steady. Jasper saw it, saw the truth of it, and without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back into the cold. That night, as the fire cracked low and Adeline slept, Silas sat beside the unfinished pine cradle. With careful hands, he took his knife, and in quiet, carved a single word into the headboard: hope. The fever came with the wind. It began as a shiver in Adeline's shoulders, brushed off as fatigue. But by nightfall, her skin burned hot and pale, her breath shallow, her eyes glassy with heat. The small cabin, once filled with the smell of soup and pinewood, now held the sharp scent of sickness. Silas Merrick had seen fever before, on battlefields, in hospital tents, in the eyes of Maeve as she lay dying. He knew the sound of labored breathing, the way a body fights in silence when it's too tired to scream. But this time, he couldn't lose again. He wrapped Adeline in every quilt he owned, built the fire high until it roared, and placed a cold cloth across her burning forehead. Still, she trembled, muttering through dreams. "Stay with me," he whispered more to himself than her. In the back corner of the cabin stood an old chest. For years, he hadn't opened the bottom drawer, not since the day Maeve's body had gone cold in his arms. But now, with his hands shaking and heart pounding, he knelt and pulled it open. Inside, wrapped in an old shawl, was her journal. The leather was cracked, the binding stiff. He ran his fingers over the familiar loops of her handwriting on the first page, then closed the book and brought it to the fire. Adeline stirred, sweat matting her red curls against her skin. Silas sat beside her, placed the book in her hands. "Maeve's," he said softly. She wrote in it most nights. Never showed it to me, but she'd want you to read it now. With trembling fingers, Adeline opened the pages. Her voice was faint, rasping. Some women dream of ballrooms. I dream of wooden floors and lullabies. She paused, the firelight dancing over the page, then continued, as if reading someone else's dream, but feeling it like her own. Her lips parted again, reading the next line. If I ever hold a child of my own, I'll cry every day. Not from sorrow, but because I'll finally know what it means to be full. Silas turned away, eyes brimming. He didn't make a sound, but the tears slipped down anyway, quiet and uninvited. Adeline looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper, her words broken by breath. I didn't think someone like me could be worth this much care. Silas knelt beside her, brushing the damp curls from her cheek. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The journal rested between them like a bridge, between past and present, loss and hope, grief and something daring to grow again. The storm hit just after dusk. Wind howled like wolves outside the cabin walls, snow driving sideways in blinding sheets, slamming against the windows like fists. The world beyond the pine logs disappeared into a white void. Inside, the fire burned high, casting golden light over every corner, every crack. Adeline's cry tore through the silence. It wasn't fear, it was pain, raw and sudden. Silas Merrick dropped the kettle he'd been filling, the clatter ringing against the wood floor. She stood near the table, doubled over, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the back of a chair. Her face was pale, mouth pressed tight, eyes wide with terror and resolve. It's happening, she whispered. Silas didn't panic. He moved, fast, quiet, focused. He stoked the fire higher, set water to boil, pulled clean linens from the chest Maeve had once kept stocked with care. His hands trembled as he spread blankets over the cot, the same cot Adeline had slept in since the day she arrived. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, he knelt beside her. You're strong, he said, voice low, steady. You've made it this far. You're not alone. Adeline grit her teeth through another wave of pain, sweat beading at her brow, despite the cold pressing at the edges of the walls. Steam rose from the kettle, fogging the windows. The room grew thick with heat, urgency, breath. He guided her gently to the cot, placing a hand behind her back. He didn't know everything about childbirth, but he knew how to listen, how to support. He remembered what Maeve once told him, half in tears, if you can't fix it, just stay close. That's all I'll need. So he did, not with skill, but with steady hands and eyes that refused to leave her. As hour bled into hour, Adeline fought the pain, the fear, the old voices that told her she'd be alone when it mattered most. But every time she looked up, Silas was there, boiling water, pressing a cloth to her brow, whispering again and again, "You're not alone." Then just before dawn, the room changed. A cry, sharp, fierce, unmistakably alive, pierced through the storm outside. Adeline collapsed back onto the pillows, tears streaking down her cheeks. Silas held the baby in his hands, tiny, red, loud with new life. His chest rose unevenly. He'd held rifles. He'd held dying men. But nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing had ever made his arms feel so full. Adeline looked at him through tears, her voice cracking. "She's yours too." Silas couldn't answer, not right away. His throat was locked, eyes wet, because in that moment, he didn't cry for loss. He cried because for the first time in years, he wanted this child to live. The snow melted slow that year. It receded in shy layers, revealing patches of earth like old wounds learning to breathe again. Adeline sat by the open window, a quilt draped over her lap, her hair loose for the first time in months. In her arms, baby Isla May slept with a fist curled tight against her mother's chest. Spring had come, not in a rush, but like a promise finally kept. Silas spent mornings splitting wood, planting early seeds in the thawed soil, and evenings teaching Isla to stand, then to stumble, then laughably to walk between two kitchen chairs with outstretched arms and a delighted squeal. Adeline laughed the first time Isla toppled into a pillow and blinked in surprise. Silas laughed too. Not a chuckle, Not a breath through the nose. A full, honest laugh. The kind he thought he'd buried with Maeve beneath the old spruce tree. There was no grand celebration, no banners or parades, just the smell of rising bread, the sound of a baby learning her voice, and the quiet rhythm of a man and woman moving in sync, one picking herbs, the other mending boots, both stopping to hold a child who reached for them with absolute trust. At night, the cabin no longer glowed just from the fire. It radiated the quiet warmth of something finally earned. Silas would sit with Isla curled against his chest, while Adeline hummed lullabies passed down from a mother she barely remembered. The pain hadn't vanished. The past wasn't erased, but something new had bloomed in its place. A life, a home, a beginning. Not all heroes ride into town with guns. Some heal with silence, with soup, with a cradle carved by hand. Silas wasn't a man of many words. When Isla giggled, grabbing his beard with chubby fingers, Silas smiled, not just at her, but at something long buried in himself. Adeline watched from across the room as his eyes softened. No words, just the quiet confession of a man who finally believed the storm had passed. And it was true. The seasons turned like pages, and 5 years slipped by like breath on glass. Dustwood Ridge had changed, just a little. The same crooked church still leaned against the wind, and the general store's roof still whistled in spring storms. But something softer had settled over the town. Something warmer. At the edge of the settlement, the old Merrick cabin stood firm, its porch now sanded smooth by little boots and rocking chairs. Inside, laughter echoed daily, bright and unashamed. The cabin had grown into a schoolhouse. It started with one child, then 3, then a dozen. Orphans, left behinds, the sort of children the world forgets. But Adeline Merrick, once the girl with no name, now stood tall at the head of the room, chalk dust on her hands, a firm but gentle smile on her face. They called her Miss Merrick, and Silas, older now, beard streaked silver, eyes soft with time, was simply Pa, to Isla, to the others, to any child who came through that door hungry for a voice that didn't yell and a hand that didn't strike. The townsfolk no longer whispered. They offered help. They left firewood. Some brought books. Some stayed to listen. In the clearing beyond the porch, a young woman now stood, the wind catching the hem of her dress. She looked out across the land that had once been nothing but frost and grief. Isla Mae Merrick, grown, steady, strong. Her voice came as a whisper over the final scene, the echo of years and love. I don't share his blood, but from his hands I learned kindness, from his eyes courage, and from his silence, how to listen for love. Shimoturni. Behind her stood the cabin they built from broken pieces. Before her stretched a life made not of bloodlines, but of choice, of healing, of deliberate love. And in that moment, the past no longer hurt. It only humbled. Some stories stay with us because they remind us of something we've lost, or something we're still searching for. Silas Merrick wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't wear a badge or carry a title. He simply showed up, quietly, consistently, and loved someone the world had discarded. And Adeline, once treated as a burden, proved that even the most broken beginnings can lead to something whole. In today's world, where so many families are scattered and people are told they're only worth what they produce or own, this story reminds us of a deeper truth. Family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes it's who stays when everyone else leaves, who builds something with you, from scratch, when all you had was ashes. Think about that in your own life. Who are the people who stood by you, not because they had to, but because they chose to? And maybe more importantly, who have you shown up for? And if this story stirred something in your heart, help us pass it on. Like, subscribe and share it with someone who still believes in quiet courage and second chances. Every view and comment helps us keep these Wild West love stories alive for the next generation, especially those who remember a time when kindness was quiet but powerful. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the strongest bonds are built not with words, but with silence, soup, and a cradle carved by hand. We'll see you on the next ride. Before you go, tell us in the comments, is family the people who share your blood, or the ones who chose to stand beside you, even when it was hard? Tell us, what shaped your idea of family?